Well, hello there, everybody, and welcome back to our series on epistemology, the study of knowledge. In this section, we're going to start studying skepticism, and we're going to take this in 3 easy parts, so hold on. Now, in the first section, we're going to study ancient forms of skepticism, and in the second section, we'll study the modern philosophers. That's the philosophy of the 1700s. And then lastly in this series, we're going to study contemporary skepticism and discussions thereof. Basically, we're going to dovetail that nicely with our discussions of Gettier problems offered earlier. Now, this is an outline that you can refer back to when you need to because there's a lot of information in this lecture, as usual, and I suggest that you watch the video more than once to digest it all. Now for a reality check. We've been talking a lot about knowledge, but can we actually quote-unquote know the universe? As Woody Allen says, my God, it's hard enough finding your way around Chinatown. The point, however, is there anything out there, and why? And must they be so noisy? Well, in order to wrap our minds around these topics, let's start a little review of history, perhaps a large one. Our story is going to take us way back in time. We're going to go back to the times of ancient Greece, Mount Olympus, the Oracle of Delphi, and that sort of thing, probably about 20,000 years ago. Way back then, Homer and Hesiod started a poetic tradition. Homer, in the 10th century BC, wrote his Iliad and Odyssey, chronicling the feats of Achilles and Odysseus, respectively, and later on, Hesiod came along and wrote his Theogony, explaining basically where the gods, and with them the universe, described by Homer, actually came from. Now, as irrational as this may seem, it actually presents something of interest to us as philosophers. Edith Hamilton describes this in her classic work on mythology as the Greek miracle. The Greeks made the gods in their own image. That had not entered the mind of man before, and that's the miracle of Greek mythology. A humanized world, men freed from the paralyzing fear of an omnipotent unknown. The terrifying irrational has no place in classical mythology. Magic, for example, is almost non-existent. Astrology, which was thriving in Persia at the time, is completely absent, and there's not a single story that has a magical priest to be terribly feared because he knows ways of winning over the gods or alienating them. Now, the chief demerit to these poets' views, as nice as they are, is one brought out by Socrates. Even if they did manage to stumble on right opinions, Socrates pointed out right opinion and knowledge are different things. There are few things I should claim to know, but that, at least, he said, is among them. The difficulty here is that what we want is something like, it seems, justification for our beliefs, and typically what the poets provided us was an appeal to inspiration in order to discover what the universe is. So, starting with the philosophers, we get a new approach to knowledge. And with it, I guess, we get a new way of humanizing the world, as Edith Hamilton describes it. Now, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle perhaps represent the zenith of this particular tradition, Socrates being the teacher of Plato, Plato being the teacher of Aristotle, and increasingly, these philosophers created more elaborate systems of metaphysics and epistemology to describe the human and reason's place in the universe. Now, if you need a mnemonic device, remember this. Remember, rub-a-dub-dub, 3 philosophers in a tub. S-P-A, SPA. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle. It's a very happy tradition, and where does it end? I'm sad to say it ends with this fellow, Alexander the Great, and his conquest from 366 to 233. Alexander the Great was, in fact, the student of Aristotle. Bertrand Russell describes the relationship between the two in his History of Western Philosophy. Everything one would wish to know about the relationships of Aristotle, the greatest teacher of the ancient world, to Alexander, the greatest conqueror, is unascertainable. The more so as legends were soon invented on the subject. There's letters between them, but they're generally regarded as forgeries. Now, people who admire both men suppose the tutor, Aristotle, influenced his pupil Alexander. Hegel, who we talked about in an earlier lecture, thinks that Alexander's career showed the practical usefulness of philosophy. To this, A.W. Ben says it would be unfortunate if philosophy had no better testimonial to show for herself than the character of Alexander. Arrogant, drunken, cruel, vindictive, and highlight this, listeners, grossly superstitious, he united the vices of a Highland chieftain to the frenzy of an Oriental despot. Be that as it may, this is what Alexander the Great's empire looked like before he started his conquests, with Macedonia up north and Greece down to the south. And this is what it looked like afterwards, and I'm highlighting here those key battles of Issus, where he defeated the Persian Empire, and Gaugamela, where the Persians tried to make a comeback and failed, leaving him to run rampant over the entire known world. Now, shortly after his death, his empire was split up into 4 competing factions. You notice Macedonia and Greece still existing over there to your left, and the Seleucids and Ptolemies taking in the brown and yellowish portions the most part, thus starting a lot of wars that you can find chronicled in like the Old Testament book of Daniel or the intertestamental books of the Maccabees. In order to better understand the cultural impact of these conquests, I'm going to turn to the philosopher and historian Will Durant. Now, Will Durant writes in his Story of Philosophy, a classic work, that the quantity of Asia proved too much for the quality of Greece. Alexander himself in his hour of triumph was conquered by the soul of the East and married among several ladies the daughter of Darius, that was the Persian emperor, and he adopted the Persian diadem and robe of state and introduced to Europe the oriental notion of the divine right of kings. Highlight that. And at last he astonished the skeptic Greece by announcing in magnificent Eastern style that he was a god. Greece laughed, and Alexander drank himself to death. Now, Aristotle, among others, openly reviled his students' pretense to divinity. In fact, one of Aristotle's relatives by the name of Callisthenes refused to bow to Alexander and was perhaps imprisoned and tortured to death. Aristotle pleaded on his behalf. In some of those letters that Bertrand Russell referred to as a forgery, Aristotle pleaded for Callisthenes, but Alexander the Great reminded Aristotle, hey, buddy, don't think it above the power of a god to put to death a mouthy philosopher if he gets out of line. So after the conquests, well, Alexander the Great pretty well drank himself to death, and there were more wars following it. And the result of this was the demise of the city-state and the common way of life for the Greek people, and the rise of small voluntary communities to take their place. Now, with that, you had a loss in the faith of the gods of the city-states, and what swept into the vacuum? Well, all sorts of things, including the rise of earth worship, astrology, and even emperor worship promoted by Alexander, all of which, as we saw from Edith Hamilton, were largely alien to the classical world of Greece. People were asking the question, where are we going and why the heck are we in this handbasket? If the world is going to hell in a handbasket, then you should suspect that people had an obvious need for a sense of serenity and a relief from the terrors and superstitions that life had brought. And into this vacuum flowed the three classic schools of Hellenist philosophy. The Hellenists, basically the Roman era philosophy, include the Epicureans, the Stoics, and the school that we are concerned with, that is the Skeptics, who sought to deal with this sort of scenario through seeking pleasure or seeking to get above the passions, apathy, or ignorance in the last case. Let's take a look at the first two schools. Now, Epicureanism and Stoicism, despite being in conflict with one another, have a lot in common. As you look at the dates on Epicurus and Zeno's lives, they would have been young men at the point in time that Alexander was conquering the world, and they would have felt the cultural impact of that most acutely. But Will Durant says they have a lot in common. Epicurus' starting point, he says, is the conviction that apathy taught by Zeno is impossible, and that pleasure, though not necessarily sensual, is the only conceivable and therefore legitimate end of life and action. You mustn't avoid the pleasures, said Epicurus, you must select them. So Epicurus is no Epicurean in the modern and hedonistic sense of the term. Epicurus exalts the joys of the intellect rather than those of the sense, and warns against pleasures that excite and disturb the soul, which they should be quieting and appeasing. In the end, Epicurus proposes to seek not pleasure in its usual sense, but mark this word, people, ataraxia, tranquility, equanimity, repose of mind, everything that trembles on the verge of Zeno's apathy. So the Hellenists really do belong in a handbasket, at least these two, in terms of their goals and how to achieve them, the goal of being ataraxia or Moving on, he says, the subtle infusion of the Asiatic soul into the wearied body of the master Greece was rapidly followed by a pouring of Oriental cults and faiths into Greece, along the very lines of communication that Alexander had opened up. The broken dikes let in an ocean of Eastern thought upon the lowlands of a still adolescent European mind. Mystic and superstitious faiths had taken root among the poorer peoples of the Hellas and were reinforced and spread about, and the Oriental spirit of apathy and resignation found a ready. Now, Epicurus of Samos and Zeno have a lot in common here. The introduction of Stoic philosophy, he says, into Athens by the Phoenician merchant Zeno was one of but a multitude of these Eastern infiltrations, both Stoicism and Epicureanism, respectively, apathetic acceptance of defeat or the effort to forget it in the arms of pleasure. They were theories as to how to be happy yet subjugated and enslaved. So we have mythology, we have the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, the conquests of Alexander the Great and all the Eastern religions, along with Epicurus and Stoicism. What in the world are we going to do with all of this? How do you make a decision as to what God you should follow? Do you know if the ones that you follow or the ones that you fail to will punish you? Are you a soul? Do you even have an afterlife you have to worry about? What laws should you follow? The laws of the state, the emperor god, or is justice a universal law above and beyond those? And is there a human nature or a science you can use to find the answers? It's terribly confusing. And into this terrifying backdrop, we're going to pour the figure of Pyrrho. Ironic name, since Pyrrho set the flames of skepticism alive into this ancient scenario. What we do know about him is that he lived on the peninsula of Greece and was born over there, as you see, in Elis, the blue section over to your left. He traveled with Alexander the Great straight into the Far East during those conquests, including the Battle of Issus and Gaugamela. And while he was out there, he met a diverse amount of thinkers, like the Persian magi, astrologers, and Indian gymnosophists. A sophist meaning wise man in the Greek, and gymno meaning naked. These were very ascetic people, and Pyrrho took those very strange lifestyles back to Greece with him. He earned an immediate following. The two big names you need to remember in Pyrrhonism, people, are of course Pyrrho, who articulated diverse ideas that he accumulated but does not have any surviving works, and his biographer Sextus Empiricus, a Roman physician, and his famous account of these teachings in the Outlines of Pyrrhonism. Now, Sextus Empiricus gives us a good idea of why people wanted to be skeptics. Skepticism is an ability or mental attitude opposing appearances to judgments in any way whatsoever, with the result that owing to equal probability of objects and reasons thus opposed, first of all, you get a state of mental suspense, and next, you get unperturbedness, or a state of quietude. That's that ataraxia we were talking about earlier. He says the skeptic, in fact, had the same experience which is said to have befallen the painter Apelles. Once they say he was trying to paint a horse's foam and was so unsuccessful, he gave up the attempt and flung at the picture the sponge he used to wipe the paints off his brush. The marks of the sponge produced the effect of horse's foam. Well, I guess that's one way that you can go about getting horse's foam into your paintings. Oh, by the way, this guy Apelles, he was the court painter for Alexander the Great. In fact, this famous mural in which Alexander the Great to the left is kicking the crap out of Darius III of Persia, pictured to your right, was based off a painting by Apelles. Returning to our quote, so too the skeptics were in hopes of gaining quietude, ataraxia, by means of a decision regarding the disparity of objects of sense and thought, but being unable to effect that, they first suspended judgment, and then they got their quietude, as if by chance it followed on their suspense, even as a shadow follows upon its substance. The problem with all these other schools of thought, Epicurus, Plato, and all those people, is that they keep trying to make judgments based upon their minimal experiences or appearances of the world. For any appearance state for you, there's any number of possible realities that are being filtered through your means of conceiving of them to give you your final judgment. The basic idea of the skeptic is if you have no grounds for thinking that your perceptual experience and the judgments you make thereon are more veridical than somebody or something else's, then your trust in your senses and the judgments that they are tending you towards is irrationally arbitrary. In other words, you lack sufficient justification, which is, as I said before, essential to having knowledge. The Hellenists are always very practical philosophers, so Sextus Empiricus is going to give us 10 modes or ways of becoming a Pyrrhonic skeptic. Consider, for example, human beings versus animal impressions. Dogs perhaps see the world in black and white as opposed to your impressions of color. Who's to say the dog isn't seeing the world more correctly? Or what about pigeons, to put a modern spin on it? Pigeons have 4 cones in their eyes, you only have 3. Who's to say the pigeon doesn't see the world correctly? Or humans versus human impressions. My feelings of cold or heat in an object don't match those of the sensitive persons. Perhaps their temperature readings and judgments thereon are more correct than mine, or oneself under different circumstances. Things will definitely appear different in the world if you're drunk or sick as opposed to being healthy. Or consider yourself viewing the same object from different angles or perspectives. The distance or angle will affect the shape or sharpness of the image you're perceiving. Who's to say one perspective isn't better than the other? Or oneself after repetitious viewing, because you make judgments about beauty based on your perceptions. But the sun is in fact as amazing as a comet. Your familiarity with the sun is what deadens you to that fact. And speaking of judgments about beauty based on experience, consider morals. You see some things as being right and see some things as being wrong. But yourself and your judgments would be different if you've been raised in another culture with different habits, dogmas, and traditions. A host of topics comes up here, but basically we need to learn perceptions don't necessarily validate judgments, and if the Pyrrhonist is right, they never really do. But the problem here is, what is the distinction between a perception and a judgment? They're very hard to disentangle from one another. For example, if you got into a field and say, hey, there's a nice barn, to relate to one of our previous examples, was that an appearance or was that a judgment? By now, you're probably thinking, wait, that could involve a judgment. Or if you go out and say, hey, that field has a sheep in it, was that an appearance or did it involve a judgment? The thing here is, if judgment is involved, you better get justification for it involved. And that, the point of justification, is where skeptics tend to make their attacks most efficiently. To distinguish between perceptions and judgments is an extraordinary talent that you're going to have to develop, and to know the relationship between the two is crucial to epistemology. But now we have to return to our story. Brian McGee in The Story of Philosophy gives us an update on Pyrrho. Well, Pyrrho had a pupil, quite a few actually, and Timon, or Timon, of Theus was the person who took Pyrrho's diverse ideas and turned them into arguments and is a chief source for the biographer Sextus Empiricus that we talked about earlier. Now, I find it ironic that even though we don't have an image of Timon or Timon, actually, Hakuna Matata, or no worries, is actually a good translation of the term ataraxia, and a very common one. So, Hakuna Matata to you, Alexander the Great. Skepticism, I guess, is supposed to be the world's first problem-free philosophy. But Timon may have been the one who formulated the infinite regress argument for skepticism, one of the most powerful arguments there is. And Aristotle or Sextus Empiricus are typically given credit for this argument, and it's sometimes called the problem of the dialelos, meaning through or by means of one another. Here's the basic idea behind it. Knowledge requires more than just having a right belief. We saw that from Socrates, right? There's a few things he does know, and that is among them. It requires, it seems, something like justification, but if that's right, then a problem comes up that even a child can understand. If you tell a child something, they may ask you for reasons for it, and if you give reasons, they'll ask, well, why do you believe that? And if you give reasons for your reasons, so on and so forth. And oftentimes this ends up very badly on the part of the adult, doesn't it? Well, the child is onto something here. To have knowledge, you got to have justification or some good grounds for what you believe. But here's the linchpin. Surely such good grounds or justifications are only good if they are supported themselves by other good grounds. How does this end? There's only one of three possible ways it could end. The first possibility is that when you support your beliefs by appealing to other beliefs, they find support from other beliefs and so on until you finally get to a foundation of beliefs that are unsupported, at least by any other beliefs themselves, but they can lend support up the chain. That is called the foundationalist response to the problem. The other possibility is that maybe you do end up appealing back to your starting point, and the accusation on the part of the skeptic is going to be, well, then you reasoned in a circular and objectionable fashion. But to put a more plausible spin on it, perhaps instead you appeal to another belief to support your first one, and so on and so forth, until finally you end up with not so much a circle, but a web of interconnected beliefs that stand in a relationship of mutual or reciprocal support. Now, that is the coherentist solution to the problem. Another possibility is, perhaps you do go back to infinity, just supporting one belief with another belief ad infinitum. That doesn't seem really plausible, and the skeptics had a lot to say about it. I'll say more about that in a minute, but right now I want to turn to another question. Who actually did come up with this problem? Was it Aristotle or Sextus Empiricus, perhaps going back as far as Timon? Well, on that question, I refuse to answer it on the grounds that I do not know the answer. But here's the case to be made for either figure. The key passages in Sextus Empiricus are outlines of Pyrrhonism, sections 14 through 16. In section 14, he quickly gives you the 10 modes, which we saw in a previous slide, or as I like to call them, the a la modes of skepticism, because after all, skepticism is a dish best served cold. But he serves you up 5 more modes in the very next section, and here's what those look like. For starters, you can have the mode based on discrepancy. Rational persons can disagree on a matter, hence you should suspend judgment. Or you get the mode based on regress. A person goes back to infinity trying to justify themselves with no starting point for their argument. Suspend judgment. Based on relativity, as we saw before, appearance states can differ from person to person. Suspend judgment. Based on hypothesis, that means the arguer started from an assumption or premise that they did not justify itself. That is, without demonstration. I'll talk about that in a second. And lastly, you have the mode based on circular reason, where the person basically assumes what they initially set out to prove. Circular reasoning is bad. Suspend judgment. Now, we've looked at 1 and number 3 of these in the previous section, but 2, 4, and 5 look suspiciously like our 3 solutions to the regress problem. So there's a new and more powerful argument here. Why did Sextus Empiricus and the Pyrrhonists offer it? Empiricus says, such are the 5 modes taught by later skeptics, perhaps Timon, and they set them forth not to throw out the previous 10, but in order to put to shame the audacity of the dogmatics in a variety of ways by these 5, as well as by those previous 10. Or did Aristotle come up with this perplexing problem? He addresses the topic under the heading, do all truths require demonstration or justification? But mind this, he is not a skeptic. He's going to come up with the foundationalist solution to the so-called problem very swiftly. He says, some people hold that owing to the necessity of knowing primary premises, there can't be scientific knowledge. Those are your skeptics. Others think there is scientific knowledge, but that all truths can be demonstrated, or to use our terminology, justified. Now that first group, the skeptics, assume that there's no way of knowing other than by demonstrating, and they say you're going to go straight on to infinity. On the other hand, they say if you do terminate the series with primary premises, those were unknown because they were not capable of being demonstrated, and that according to them was the only form of knowledge. Notice here, however, Aristotle says according to them, because that's precisely where Aristotle is going to hop off their bandwagon. Then you have the other party, which agrees with them regarding knowing, holding that it's only possible by demonstrating, that is, justifying your initial starting points, but they see no difficulty in holding that all truths are demonstrated on the ground that the demonstration can be circular, or the term that I prefer, listeners, that is reciprocal. Aristotle says his own doctrine is that not all truth or knowledge is demonstrative. On the contrary, knowledge of immediate premises is independent of demonstration. Read through this explanation by Aristotle, and you'll see some things standing out to you. Terms that stand out are terms like necessary, obvious, it must be the case, must, he says. And for Aristotle, this is not so much a problem as it is an insight. The insight is foundationalism is the right approach to knowledge. So when it comes to the child, well, we know exactly what Aristotle is ultimately going to say to them when this gets started. But let's put a more sophisticated spin on it. He's going to say that there are initial starting points that we are justified in believing without having to justify. So to summarize, you got three possibilities. Either you're going to have to terminate the series at some points with a foundation, or you're going to have to appeal to the fact that all your beliefs stand together in a mutually coherent or reciprocal relationship of support, or you're going to go half straight back to infinity. Let's talk about that infinitivist solution here real quick. It hasn't got very many supporters, but the one who does support it is Peter Klein out at Rutgers, pictured here with and without facial hair. And if you want to see a person support this in the modern context, go to him. But I'm going to raise two problems for the infinitivist solution. Problem number one for the infinitivist solution. Is it even psychologically possible for us as finite beings to have an infinite amount of mental states, one justifying another? The problem is we're dealing with beliefs when we deal with epistemology. Well, at least epistemologists are concerned with propositional knowledge, and propositional knowledge, we said in the previous lesson, does seem to involve a belief that some proposition is true, like the belief that the earth revolves around the sun. Now, clearly the infinitivist is going to stress a distinction. Not all beliefs are occurrent beliefs, that is, they're not beliefs you are presently entertaining. They can be dispositional. Those are beliefs that you hold, but you're not holding them before your mind's eye right now. Now, this is true, but what is the relevance of it? In either case, it seems like the infinitivist is requiring us to have an impossibly large amount of propositional attitudes. How can we as finite beings fit all of those into our skull? But there's a bigger problem. Even if it is psychologically possible for us to have all these infinite number of dispositional beliefs, one justifying the other and justifying another ad infinitum, would that even solve the problem? And here's the linchpin for the skeptic. Suppose I have one belief that's held up that is supported by another belief, like a rung in a chain, and that is supported or held up by a further rung in a chain, and that is further supported by another belief. And, well, where does this end up? Well, if it goes to infinity, what kind of chain do you wind up with? Do you end up with an infinitely supported chain, or if there's no place to ultimately hang this, is the chain just going to fall as a system of beliefs falls or collapses where there's no starting point? The skeptic says the final result of this is just a system of unsupported beliefs, and hence the justificatory problem has not been solved. If that's the truth, then the end result of this conversation is we really only have two possibilities for answering the skeptic, the foundationalist or the coherentist response. For now, let's just make this the second lesson. It's unclear as to what structure justification even could take, but it seems that we can draw the conclusion that it must take one of two forms, and that leads us into a discussion of foundationalism versus coherentism that I'll have to return to. Speaking of returning, let's return to our story. At this point in history, Plato's Academy comes under siege of skepticism. Timon, or Timon, had a pupil by the name of Arcesilas, and he is the first skeptic to take over Plato's Academy, and it would dominate the Academy for centuries thereafter. The thing you need to know about Arcesilas is that he's the first skeptic to actually out Socrates. Socrates said that he knew nothing. Arcesilas said, "I don't even know that I know nothing." Now that's a very unstable position, but that was the position held by the Pyrrhonists. So basically what you have is a person that says no proposition should be believed. In fact, don't even believe that proposition. And while you're on it, don't believe the proposition that you should believe the proposition that no propositions should be believed. Good grief, how did they get themselves into this incredibly unstable position? Well, the problem was apparently that the Pyrrhonists were in danger of being called hypocrites. I mean, they went around telling everybody else, hey, you shouldn't dogmatize about this or that or the other, and as soon as they become heads of the academy, what do? They go around teaching everybody their doctrines. But Sextus Empiricus replies, no, that's not the case. Look, just as the formula, all things are false, rejects itself, and so does the formula, nothing is true, well, that rejects itself as being true, so our formula, don't believe one thing more than another, asserts of itself like all the rest, don't even believe our doctrine any more than all the rest, and of all other formula, he says, we say the same. And so while the dogmatizer posits his matter of dogma as a substantial truth, the skeptic enunciates his formula, so they virtually cancel themselves out, so he should not be said to dogmatize in his enunciation of them. Now, I don't know if that's a really good response to the allegation of hypocrisy or self-contradiction towards the Pyrrhonists, and perhaps Arcesilas' pupil and the next successor as the head of the academy didn't agree with that response as well. His name was Carneades, pictured here to the left. He's a very powerful skeptic, and he tried to create a more stable position. He marks the transition from Pyrrhonism to academic forms of skepticism, the latter of which would dominate Plato's Academy thereforth. Now, don't make any mistake, people, he's still a skeptic. As Brian McGee relates, his, that is, Arcesilaus' successor Carneades, made a great stir on his visit to Rome by giving a series of public lectures. In the first, he forcefully expounded the views of Plato and Aristotle on justice, and then in his second, he refuted everything he had said in the first. Classic skepticism, people. But there are vital differences between the two camps. The academic skeptics on the one hand said, yeah, we can know our doctrine as a positive fact. We know we lack knowledge. The Pyrrhonic skeptic says, nope, you don't even know that. Now, Carneades said genuine knowledge requires certainty, and humans are restricted to probabilities. But Arcesilaus had said, we don't even know what probabilities hold. We don't know if it's 50-50 if a coin will come up heads or tails. Thus, probabilities for Carneades will suffice for rational belief, and he gives you a guidepost with which to live your everyday life. But the Pyrrhonics, led by Arcesilaus, would say, nope, all attachments to belief are thus irrational, and therefore avoid those attachments and you get your ataraxia that we were all after. That's serenity. But there are crucial similarities between the two camps that we need to look at. Both assumed that you had access immediately to the concepts of your perceptions. In other words, you're entitled to your appearance states. Whether or not you're justified in the judgments you make on them is a different topic for them. And they both assumed those appearance states to be the result of some external world. Now, they did raise the problem of the external world later, and I'll cover that. But for now, they both assumed causation. The external world is causing your appearance states. And both were substantive skeptics. In other words, I mean, they were trying to make skeptics out of people and were skeptics themselves. Although the Pyrrhonists would debate the use of my term substantive here. Now, both had the goal or lifestyle of imperturbability, serenity, ataraxia, and interestingly, both camps took the existence of appearance states for other people. There are other minds having their own perceptions. They took that for granted. Now, I'm going to bring up that topic later on, but moving on now, what we can say is that it became a debate within the camps of skepticism itself at what point skepticism became contrary to reason. As we saw, some positions, like the Pyrrhonist position articulated by Arcesilaus, seems very unstable. Does skepticism become objectionably unstable at a much earlier point? Well, for now, I want to move on to the topic of the intermediate period between ancient skepticism and the moderns that we're going to study next. Those of you who know history know that there was a large Christian era in between the two. What did the Christians think about this topic of skepticism? I can summarize it for you in terms that Brian McGee lays out. Sextus Empiricus and Pyrrho were publicly denounced by St. Gregory as early as the 4th century AD for, and I quote, infecting the people with the vile and malignant disease of skepticism. Christians had a generally negative response to skepticism, and that shouldn't surprise you. Look at the topics we raised. What God should I follow? Will they punish me? Do I have a soul? If so, what or not? What law should I follow? Is there such a thing as justice that we saw Carneades poo-pooing on just earlier? Or is there a human nature or science that you can appeal to find the answers? Obviously, people in the Christian camps are going to want to weigh in heavily on these issues. Nobody weighed in more heavily on these troubling issues than did St. Augustine of Hippo. He's the anti-skeptical saint who is sometimes overlooked in the history of epistemology, and you guys are going to see exactly why we should cover him and we should know him in detail. Well, St. Augustine lived between 354 and 430 AD, right at the time the Roman Empire was collapsing. He was born in North Africa, which incidentally probably makes him a black or at least dark-skinned philosopher, and in his search for truth and happiness, he turned to the Manichaean religion for 9 years. That's a Persian religion that's a synthesis of Zoroastrianism and Christianity, and one of those Eastern influences that followed Alexander the Great into Greece. But then he gave up and turned to be a skeptic, and he couldn't find knowledge and consequently not happiness until he turned ultimately to Plato and then to Christianity. All this is documented in history's first autobiography, The Confessions of St. Augustine. Now, immediately thereafter, he turned on the skeptics hardcore and wrote his book Against the Academicians. That doesn't mean, people, that he's against academics and learning. That means he's against the New Academy of Cicero, which he identifies as the successor to the skepticism that arose in Plato's Academy. After that, he wrote his book The Teacher in 389, in which he depicts the second person of the Trinity, that is Jesus, as John 1:9 depicts him, the true light, lighting every man that comes into the world and giving us knowledge. More on that in a moment. But here's 5 questions of epistemic importance for St. Augustine, and we're going to take them one by one. We already raised the first one earlier. Is there a rational limit for skepticism? And St. Augustine says, yes, absolutely. Well, Augustine answers, but without any delusive representations of images or phantasms, that means without the 5 senses or any appearance states, I am most certain that I am, I know it, and I delight in it. In respect of these 3 truths, I'm not afraid of the arguments of the academicians who say, well, what if you're deceived? Augustine answers, well, if I'm deceived, si falor, then I am, sum. Si falor sum, people. How can you be deceived if you don't even exist? Well, how does Augustine know that? Well, he says we have another and far more superior sense. Call it a sixth sense, maybe given to us by the teacher that I mentioned earlier, belonging to the inner man, by which we perceive what things are moral and immoral. It's the same source that gives us moral knowledge. And this sense, he says, is not aided in its functions by the eyesight, orifices of the ears. That function doesn't need any of the other five senses. And by that sense, he says, I'm assured both that I am and that I know it. And as we saw, I'm assured that I love or delight in the fact that I know these sorts of things. Now, even though I'm quoting from his magisterial work, The City of God, these ideas can be found in an earlier form in his monograph On True Religion, which was written in 388. That means right in between the time he wrote against the academicians and the teacher. So he came out against the skeptics with a bang. But for now, at what point does skepticism become contrary to reason? St. Augustine says, I exist, and I know it, and I'm happy I know it. 3 points at which skepticism cannot make any inroads. But there's also the issue of what structure should justification take. Now here I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit, people. It looks like what St. Augustine is suggesting is that he has maybe a foundation of beliefs that he does not need the five senses to support. He knows 3 things: I am, I know it, and I'm happy I know it. But he may be suggesting that we can raise a superstructure against the skeptic on the basis of this. So maybe Augustine is suggesting a foundationalist project, maybe he's not. I'm just going to leave that to the side right now. But on the topic of whether there's an external world, the topic did come up. Actually, it came up pretty early. This is actually a very old question. You can find it in the writings of Plato, where Socrates asked Theaetetus, there's a question you must have often heard people ask, the question of what evidence we could offer if we were asked whether in this present instance we're asleep and dreaming all our thoughts, or whether we're awake and talking to each other. And the question is not answered. Theaetetus says, yes, Socrates, it's certainly difficult to find a proof of what we want. The 2 states do correspond in all their characteristics. Now, this topic was raised, but it was not answered by Plato. One person that takes it even less seriously, that would be Aristotle. Aristotle writes, some people are perplexed because they want to know who's going to be the judge of who is healthy, that is, has the healthy 5 senses, and in general on each subject who will judge it correctly. That's a classic Pyrrhonist question, people. But such perplexities, he says, are similar to the perplexing question, are we now asleep or awake, and they all have the same force. He writes it off. He says, those who pose them ask for a justification or demonstration for everything. They seek a principle as they seek to get it through demonstration. And the trouble is, as I just said before, you cannot justify everything. You cannot have a demonstration for everything. So Aristotle sets the problem to the side. But not so with Augustine. In his work against the academicians, you see the skeptic saying, well, how do you know even that the world exists if you admit that the senses are deceptive? And Augustine says, well, I call the whole that sustains and contains us, whatever it is, the world, that whole, I say, that appears before me. The phenomena he refers to as the world. Is what you see the world even if you're asleep? Augustine replies, it's already been said, I call the world whatever seems to me to be such. Now, this is interesting. It seems that Augustine settles for a phenomenological world in response to skepticism. That's a first move in Western philosophy. Augustine is appealing to the world of the mind as he enjoys it. If St. Augustine does have a foundationalist project on his agenda, then the superstructure he raises on that is a world of phenomenal experiences, and that's going to be troubling for future philosophers. In the next section, we're going to study René Descartes and John Locke and the modernist philosophers, but they're living in a day and age of new science, and it seems like the truths of that science are truths about an external world, and I mean truths about mind-independent facts. To that extent, it looks like St. Augustine's phenomenological solution is not going to be very satisfactory to them. But moving on, let's talk about perception, on which science is supposedly based. Is it reliable? Paste the 10 modes of skepticism and Pyrrhonism that we saw earlier. Well, St. Augustine answers in Against the Academicians. The skeptic says, tell me whether the leaves of the wild olive tree, which the goat so stubbornly finds delightful and desires, are bitter in themselves. And Augustine answers, you shameless man, the goat itself has more modesty. I don't know how they are to brute animals. I just know they're bitter to me. In other words, hey, I have my perceptions and I'm entitled to them. My phenomenological world is mine. But that brings up a problem. If St. Augustine is willing to settle for a world of phenomena, how does he know there are other minds that have their own phenomenological world or world of apparent states? And this is interesting. Here he concedes a lot less to the skeptic. In his work on the Trinity, he says, even the beasts or animals perceive as living not just themselves, but they perceive us as living, but roughly a synonym for having a mind. Nor do they see our souls, that is minds, except through the motions of our bodies, and they do that by immediately and very simply by a kind of natural agreement. And therefore we too know the mind of anyone else at all from the fact of our own. And from our own case, we believe in what we do not perceive or know immediately. For not only do we perceive a mind in others, including the beasts, but we even know what one is by first considering our own, for we have a mind. Now, it seems that he's the first to formulate the problems of other minds in Western culture, and he seems to offer what appears to be an analogy. We know first our own case, and then we make an inference based on similarity to other cases. So, in other words about the goat, what he's going to say is, I may be a skeptic about the content of their mental states, but whether or not they have a phenomenological world of their own, a mind in which they enjoy those mental states, I'm not going to be a skeptic about that. So the lesson the skeptics gave us earlier, that perceptions don't necessarily validate judgments, well, that may be spot on, but as we saw, Augustine does not put a lot of weight into perception and the five senses whatsoever. What he says instead is that it's not perception alone, but that natural light that he talks about, maybe the teacher or the natural agreement that leads us to knowledge of other minds. Perception can't get the job done, but don't worry people, we have an extra sense that helps the job get done for us. But that's St. Augustine's view. Now, let's move on to one other question. What about the megamind? What about the mind of God? And I have to bring up this topic here. He addresses it in his book on the free choice of the will. It becomes significant for us in later lectures. St. Augustine offers what is perhaps history's first ontological argument for God's existence. That basically means an argument that is not based on any appeal to the five senses or information you've gotten from him. It basically goes like this. The first premise is that anything meeting the following definition must be God. X is God basically means that X is superior to my mind or rational soul, and nothing is superior to it. In other words, it's the maximum superior thing. Now, we know that truth is more excellent than our minds. How do we know that? Well, the fact is my mind submits to the truth once it gets the truth. So, what we have here is a result that either truth must be the God or something superior to it is the God, and in either case, hey, you get a God. How's that for an argument, people? Well, I think Gareth Matthews puts the point on this. He says of later ontological arguments, St. Augustine's argument is no doubt one of the least impressive of this series of arguments, but hey, it's a start. St. Anselm, of course, goes on to produce a line of reasoning that has been one of the most discussed arguments in the whole history of Western philosophy. By way of contrast, St. Augustine's argument rates little more than a, hey, good try, Augustine, but it's the beginning of a project that continues right up to the present time. Let me comment a little bit on this. Now, it's easy to dismiss Augustine's argument and say, well, that just proves the existence of, maybe, truth, assuming that truth is a very excellent thing that I submit my mind to, but the key insight by Augustine, it really goes deeper than that. Basically, the idea is, whatever concept of God you're working with, whether you're dealing with an ontological argument or not, you've got to be thinking big G God. He has to ring the bell or max out on every conceivable scale of excellence or goodness whatsoever. And that idea that God is, due to a conceptual truth, the maximally conceivable, excellent, or superior thing is really a key insight that future arguers are going to appeal to. But for now, what I'm going to leave you guys with is the idea that St. Augustine of Hippo is a crucial link to the modern philosophers. He's oftentimes overlooked in the history of epistemology and in your textbooks and classes on the topic, and I've just filled in that crucial blank for you. It'll make a lot more sense when we cover our next lecture, and I look forward to seeing you guys then. Thank you for your patience. Bye-bye.